I was born in 1979 in Seoul, South Korea. My mom and dad divorced, I believe, when I was around 4 or 5. My mom worked very hard for a period of about 2 to 3 years to get ready to basically make the big decision to move to the US with me as a single mom, not really knowing English or having the resources to move to a foreign country, but with the hope and faith that moving to the US would provide me and her with better opportunities. In the 80s, when we immigrated to the US, I think that's right around when there was what we call the Asian wave, when they started immigrating to the US. When we first moved, we moved to Arlington, Texas, so the DFW Metroplex, because my mom's sister, her husband, and their family were already living in Arlington. And so when we first moved to the States, we moved in with them, lived with them for a few months. I remember going to school, it was Short Elementary, and they enrolled me in ESL, English as a Second Language. I did that for about 2 to 3 months, and I was 7 years old. And when you're 7, you pick up the language pretty quickly. And I learned that I had an aptitude for learning foreign languages. And so after 3 months, they said I was good, and they put me in regular class with everybody else. But I remember it still being scary when you don't know the language and, customs, food, everything else is very different. And so it was scary, but thankfully, when you're a child, you're pretty flexible and agile, and you adapt pretty quickly. And so I'm very grateful that I was able to adapt, and everybody was very welcoming. But it was a mix of lots of different experiences. I was very blessed to be born into a family of believers. I know that when missionaries first started coming to Seoul, South Korea, what I've been told by my family is that my family was one of the first on both sides, both my dad and my mom's side, who converted to Christianity when missionaries first started coming to Korea. And so I believe I'm fourth or fifth generation Christian. And so I grew up even in Korea watching my grandmothers. They were prayer warriors. And to me, that was my normal. And so my mom was a strong believer, and I think that was a big part of the courage that she had to do what she did. And so as long as I've known, I've always felt that God was with me. When my mom and I first moved here, obviously, I think she had the support of her sister, which was super helpful. But obviously, she wanted to become independent, and she started out working hard, long hours as a waitress. She worked the lunch shift, she would come pick me up in between, and then she worked the dinner shift late into the evening. And so I watched her work really hard, 7 days a week. And again, that work ethic that she had, I think, really made a big impact on me. And just knowing that hard work is important, but also doing it with joy and hope for a better life. Even though I feel that I assimilated really well into the culture, absolutely, I experienced a lot of racism and bigotry growing up. And even now, frankly, I recall a recent experience where, sorry, I'm going to cry. This one's a little bit emotional. Um, where I was with my son, who was actually 7 years old. And we were at Crate and Barrel here in Plano, and a woman just hurled really ugly words, racist words. And for me personally, it was okay because as an adult, right, they're just words, and it's coming from a place of ignorance or whatever it is. But for my 7-year-old son who grew up here, to hear those words, and I think it really shook him and it scared him. Even though for him, he's an American, he grew up here, he was born here, and he doesn't know why that happened to him. And so having to have that conversation with him early was difficult. One thing, especially being an Asian American, is that Asian Americans, there are, I think, over 150 countries that represent the Asian culture. And even within the community, it's vastly different experience. An East Asian like myself, so those are Chinese, Koreans, Japanese Americans, are vastly different from South Asians, like Indians, and we have a lot of Indians in the Frisco community as well. And so culturally, even, we may be categorized as Asians, but there's vast differences in our culture. And so even for me, I don't know fully all of the different cultures and experiences. And I, shared also for my son who was born here. And for him, even though he looks Asian on the outside, he's fully American, and he's never been to Korea. So he doesn't have that bicultural context that I have. And so it's really interesting, being a second generation American, having that context of first generation, my mom's perspective, then my perspective, and then I see my son's perspective. It's vastly different. And I think it's not that much different from the experiences of even European immigrants who went through the same thing. But it's that, they started on that journey before us, right? But if you go to the East Coast, they still have areas where immigrants from European descent, they still have their culture and they celebrate their culture. But I think with Asian Americans, the wave of immigration from Asian countries didn't start until later. And so the understanding of that culture didn't really resonate, and frankly still doesn't resonate with some people, right? Because we're still learning, and we're in that learning mode. Whereas with some of the other cultures of European descent, that started much earlier than Asian Americans and the Asian American experience. So I've always known since I was a little girl that I wanted to be an attorney. I don't know why. It's just something that I've always wanted to be. I wanted to be a litigator. I wanted to be in the courtroom. I know people say, I like to argue. Maybe that's part of what it was. I don't know. But because of that, I always focused my education around preparing to go to law school. So I did debate in high school. I attended Baylor University and majored in political science, knowing that I would want to go to law school right after. So after graduating from Baylor, I went to what's now Texas A&M Law School in Fort Worth. And so I've been in the North Texas area since then. Very thankful. So currently I am the general counsel and corporate secretary of the Susan G. Komen Breast Cancer Foundation. I think a lot of people are familiar with Komen. We just refer to ourselves as Komen, as the world's largest breast cancer organization. So I joined Susan G. Komen about 5 years ago, right before COVID started. And then COVID hit. And then actually that year, unbeknownst to me, obviously God knew, but I was diagnosed with breast cancer myself. And so full God moment for me, working for the largest breast cancer nonprofit, knowing or not knowing that I would go through my own breast cancer journey. And so working at Komen today is not just a job, but a mission. And the mission is very personal to me. So I met my husband the year that I graduated from law school. He had just moved to the Dallas area from New York. Dice was born in New Jersey. His dad was actually an expat working for Goldman Sachs. So his dad was one of the first traders on Wall Street from Japan. So our son Chase is 10 years old because he's the only child. He's a grown adult in a kid's body oftentimes because he hangs out with a lot of adults. He plays a lot of baseball, and he will be going into middle school. I think as we become more of a diverse community and live in a more diverse community, some suggestions that I have just as someone who was given this benefit of doubt or, welcome or invitation is to really look at everyone in terms of the lens of kingdom diversity versus worldly diversity. I think a lot of the times we categorize people into boxes, they're from this background or this descent or, just the stereotypes that we have, which I understand, we're humans and we all have them and we have our biases. But if we really look through the lens of people as he or she is God's child versus being of this background or that background, then you really look at the person as a whole, and you look through their cultural differences, and I think you really see more that you have in common with that person than you would if you just look through the lens of physical appearance or cultural background. I do think, we live in a very divisive world that if, as Christians and as believers, if we can all take lead in looking at others through the lens that God looks at them, then I think we could change the world, and we could lead by example, and we could cut through a lot of this divisiveness, I think.